Hello and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. And my guest today is Omri Rachum-Twaig, who is an adjunct professor at the Tel Aviv University Buchman Faculty of Law. And we're going to be talking about his new book, just coming out from Routledge, called Copyright Law and Derivative Works, Regulating Creativity. So welcome, Omri, to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Brian. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, this is great. You're my second international interview. Omri is obviously in Israel. So setting up the podcast involved a lot of time difference today. So we've corresponded quite a bit on Twitter, etc. And I'm really interested in your work on creativity in relation to copyright, which I think is really interesting, novel, and not something I've really seen before. And I really enjoyed reading your book as well, which I think is going to make an interesting and important contribution. And I was wondering if you could just start by kind of laying out the structure of the book itself, because your argument kind of comes in like 5 parts. You know, you've
right.
got
That's correct. Right.
a few kind of different angles that you take in laying out your position. And I was wondering, because there's just so much for us to talk about in half an hour, I was going to just lay out the parts of your argument.
Right, great. So I'll definitely do that. And I can say that although the book is divided into 5 main chapters, it's I can characterize it as probably divided into 3 main parts. So we have a first part, which is probably the biggest motivation for this research, which is a discussion on non-legal thoughts and understandings and fields of study that relates to creativity, in order to attempt establishing some conclusions or notions about what the creative process is, what creativity is all about, not through the lens of copyright, rather through the lens of other non-legal fields. So that would be a first part, which is divided into 2 specific chapters. One is dedicated to creativity studies and cognitive psychology as a field of knowledge for the research of the creative process and what creativity is. And the other one focuses on genre theories, which I see as a kind of a more complementary approach to what creativity is, because it not only focuses on the individual creative process, right, the cognitive process of the author, rather on what creativity is also in a more perhaps sociological or philosophical standpoint, including also the audience of works, the work products themselves, not only the individual creative process. So this would be, I guess, a characterization of the first part of the first non-legal part of the book. The second part kind of crosses the border towards the legal realm, but it stops at the more higher level of the more normative legal approaches. So it discusses the derivative works right, or copyright generally, but specifically the derivative works right as a case study, beginning with its theoretical understandings or normative justifications that are kind of let's say intra-legal, right? So the legal normative viewpoint of what the derivative works right is all about, what copyright is all about, why do we justify copyright at large, and derivative works or the derivative works right specifically. So this I would characterize this as a second part of the book, which holds 1 specific chapter. This is chapter 3 of the book. And then we have the final part, I guess, would be the more doctrinal part, that kind of harnesses these conclusions, both from the non-legal discussion and the more inner intra-legal theoretical discussion, into a more kind of a down-to-earth concrete discussion of how the derivative works right doctrine works kind of in reality, to show the challenges and potential fixes to these challenges. So these are chapters 4 and 5 of the book, and I think that would be a pretty comprehensive kind of outline of the the different kind of methodological and general kind of descriptions of the 3 parts of the book.
I think that's right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. You summarize it better than I do. It's your books, unsurprisingly.
Well, I guess you read it more recently than I did, so.
Yeah. Well, so what would be, I think would be really helpful for people, especially lawyers and law professors who may not be as familiar with literary theory, for example, would be if you could say a little something about creativity theory or creativity research and genre theory, both what they are, sort of what they tell us, and then maybe sort of branch into how they can help us think about creativity in the copyright context, and specifically in relation to derivative works. And maybe just kind of starting with a kind of a broader description of creativity.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I completely agree that the motivation to specifically discuss these types of non-legal professions, right, or fields of study, is not necessarily obvious or natural to legal scholarship generally, and copyright scholarship particularly. And perhaps maybe I can take a step back and discuss kind of the general motivation to this research, which also kind of leads to the motivation to delve into these specific fields of study. So perhaps I should say that before before turning to law, I started as my kind of professional life as a musician. I was actually a percussion player
with some very impressive orchestras, I must say.
That's well, that was a fun part of life.
I mean, not that many people got to play with Pierre Boulez. I mean, that's like
that's true, and he was already 80 plus when I had the opportunity to play under his baton. But he was magnificent. But Daniel Barenboim as well, and Sabine Mehta and others. Wow. So this was a really exciting period, time period in my life, and I studied music as a performer, and I did practice music. I professionally performed for several years, and then I turned to law for various reasons. But the idea of creativity, of incorporating innovation and creativity and creative thought in my legal career was kind of a goal, right? An almost necessary goal in my first years in law studies. And when I started thinking about research projects for my coming towards my PhD studies, when I first studied copyright law in law school, and I studied about the derivative works right, and the concept that you actually need to get, and this is not an obvious thing for musicians, right, or for authors, the idea that you actually have to obtain a permission to make some kind of correspondence with an existing work, to use parts from this work for added for subsequent works, or additional creativity, or even commenting or corresponding with this work, and not in a fair use sense, right, but in an actual professional endeavor. Well, it's really not an obvious idea or notion for musicians, authors.
It's so true, because I came from the fine art world, and it was the same thing. I was like, I started law school, and was like, are you kidding me?
Yeah, so exactly. So this was exactly the feeling I got when I first studied derivative works and copyright law generally, and then when I started thinking about a research project, so the derivative works right was obviously going to be my topic, but since I came from this kind of more, I don't know, artistic profession or whatever you want to call this, I thought that it must be. Or I must include in this type of research some kind of understanding of how important is using pre-existing works, how common is the actual act of making derivative works in the field of authorship, right? In the creativity world. And when I was posed with this question, it's challenging to figure out a methodology that would be good enough, right, and feasible to establish this kind of a substantial part of a research, of an academic research, right, to be part of a PhD thesis, dissertation, and I was kind of thinking about potentially doing some kind of more let's say empirical research that would actually try to assess how many works are incorporating previous, existing works or parts or substantial parts from previous works. And that seems, almost impossible, right? Yeah. Because there's so many different fields of creativity. There are so many different styles and
really, how do you know? Ultimately,
yeah, exactly, and exactly, and how do you know? So you can go, for a more, let's say, qualitative empirical research and try, interviewing authors and artists and innovators, which is fine, which is interesting. But I it's interesting. But first, I'm not sure I had a qualification to do this type of research, and I'm not sure it would have yielded, vast enough results for me to make general conclusions about creativity, right? About the derivative works, right, at large.
Yeah.
And then the alternative was trying to figure out what fields of knowledge, what other kind of more scientific fields of knowledge, right? Scientific in a kind of a broad sense, right? Fields of research would potentially yield this type of general results about how creativity looks like, and whether or not, and to what extent, it includes the use of or the reliance upon pre-existing knowledge, expressions, works, memory, etc. And the immediate suspect was cognitive psychology. I did some preliminary research, and I saw that there's a significant amount of literature on the cognitive process of creativity and creativity studies, which are kind of a family name for all sorts of let's say psychological research, but also some more kind of neuroscience research on how creativity works. At least from the viewpoint of the individual, right, and the individual author. So that was an immediate suspect, and it turned out that there's a lot of literature to review and to see if it could potentially be beneficial for this type of research. And but then I again, as I described in my kind of a more general description of the book, I thought that only looking at this from the viewpoint of the author, right, from the lens of what the cognitive process of an individual author is, would not be enough. Because when we're talking about creativity and we're talking about the value of works of authorship, which are questions that are obviously of interest for copyright law, we're not only talking about authors, right? We're also talking about society at large. We're talking about audiences and how they value works of authorship, and now how society looks at creative products and appreciates them and values them and corresponds with them. And for this purpose, I was looking for another field of knowledge that would perhaps reveal some notions on this more, on this broader conceptualization of what creativity is. And I had some talks with my supervisor and other researchers that I had access to, and they recommended looking into literary theories. And when I started looking into literary theories, I realized that the specific field of genre theory does exactly that.
Yeah.
It's exactly about how, right.
That was great, because I remember studying genre theory many years ago as a film studies student, and it was just such a welcome sort of way of thinking about how people do creativity in context. So I really love that in particular. But I was wondering if maybe we could just take a little step back, and maybe you could say something a little specific about the creativity studies that you looked at in your book and what they tell us about how authors do creativity, and then maybe segue into talking about how that relates to genre theory and kind of creativity social context.
Yeah, definitely. So this would we'll have to do this kind of with a wide brush, right?
Because you cover so much stuff in your book.
I've done quite a lot of reading. Yeah, people often from different disciplines ask me, what's the methodology for laws, right? For legal research, and I'm saying, reading a lot.
Reading a lot. The amount of material you cover in your book is frankly phenomenal. I was like, wow, it's incredible resource, and really made me think like, golly, like there's a lot of stuff I should really be looking at that I don't know.
Yeah. So I'll soon touch upon what you asked for, but I'll just say that the reason I did so much reading and I tried to cover a lot of literature, at least to the extent I was able to trace and understand, was that I must say I have no formal education in the field of cognitive psychology, right? And to assure that I was actually covering important scholarship, right, and important literature and relevant and applicable literature, I really did. I forced myself to do a lot of reading before even allow myself to start writing anything about a field of knowledge that is not something that I'm formally competent with. I did have advisors from our from the Tel Aviv University psychology department. They helped a lot, focusing me on and pointing me to important literature. But as I read along, I got to the point where I think I understood what was the important literature and the relevant one. But yes, it included a lot of reading. So I think the interesting thing about, or at least my experience with cognitive psychology and creativity studies, is that there are a lot of approaches and methodologies in this field of study with respect to the question, how should the process of creation be described, studied, explained, etc. So there's really there is a very, very large variety of methodologies and aspects in which this is viewed. But I think that the main literature or the main theoretical literature in cognitive psychology and creativity studies with respect to creativity and the process of creation attempts to describe the stages and components, and this is what's referred to as the stage and componential approach to creativity. It attempts to generally describe what are the necessary, the characteristic stages and components of a typical creative process. And this is, for me, this was a very, very interesting starting point, because it matches the motivation I had. I wanted to try and extract, notions and understandings that are general in their character, that could generally account for how creativity looks like. Now, obviously, this could be criticized in many ways, and it by the way, it's also criticized by some creativity studies commentators, and there are some other approaches trying to kind of pinpoint more specific research approaches, using experiments and kind of more empirical work, specifically in the fields of neuroscience and kind of more, let's say, more scientific approaches to creativity. But still, these general research approaches to creativity, talking about stages and components, are very central to the field, and they were very useful for me as a starting point. Right, I obviously kept reading and referring to other approaches as well, but this was a very good starting point. And the interesting thing was that even within this approach to creativity, this stage and componential approach, there are various accounts of how the creative process looks like. But as an outsider, someone who looks at this scholarship, not from within, what was interesting to me was that there are some characterizations of the creative process and the stages and components that are intrinsic, right? That are almost inevitable in the creative process, that are common to all these different scholars and researchers and literature. And this was obviously a great catch for me, specifically because it also kind of or at least for me, it was very evident that this corresponds with understandings of, or at least implied understandings of how creativity looks like in copyright law. So this was a very, a jackpot for me, reading this scholarship. And when I refer to this, I'm talking about the two general stages that I characterize in my discussion on cognitive psychology and creativity studies about the creative process, where the first stage, or the first part, or at least one part of creativity and the creative process, is often characterized as a stage or as a state of unfocused, kind of more abstract thought. Not necessarily conscious thought, but it could also be conscious. That is basically planting the seeds, or maybe producing the first kind of sparks, if we speak metaphorically, right? Sparks that initiate the creative process. But at the same time, all these approaches and researches are also describing a different stage, or a different part of the creative process, that commonly discusses this general thought about the crystallization of this abstract, non-focused thought into concrete ideas or tools or creative products, right? Solutions, if we're talking about problem solving as a characterization of what creativity is, that is very very conscious, very specific. And the tool for this part of the creative process is usually referred to as the use of what these fields of knowledge describe as domain-relevant knowledge. Domain-relevant knowledge, domain-relevant memory. And this obviously clicked with what I'm trying to say, intuitively trying to say.
Yeah, we so often think of creativity as just being about the spark, but it's that second.
Right.
It's the domain-relevant knowledge that that people forget about, and it really, and obviously that really ties into your discussion of genre theory, and I can see exactly why it led you there, because that's what it's all about, huh?
Definitely. And when we're talking about if we shift, to genre theory for a second, when we're so the focus of genre theory, and this is how we commonly non-academically use the word genre for, right? We're talking about these common building blocks, right? These common features that we all use in order to be able to actually speak, right? Speak artistically, but also genre theory also applies to to speech acts and to actual speech in communications. But if we're using these notions at least in the field of creativity and arts, then the basic notion that there is a common there is common grounds, there are common tools that we almost must use in order to speak in a cognate, in a perceivable manner with our community, is a central pillar of genre theory across the board, right? Beginning from more kind of prescriptive theories that actually take these type of building blocks as rules for how to create, right? For how to make arts, which traces back to the the more kind of classical era.
That's so great. Yeah, and it really, what I love about it is that you take a lot of you use these tools to take a lot of fundamental concepts in copyright law and actually engage with them in a much more fundamental way. I mean, because the way you're talking about creativity and creativity studies and genre theory ties in so deeply with copyrightable subject matter and the idea expression dichotomy, and how we think about the relationship between copyrightable subject matter and what's available to anyone, what isn't copyrighted.
Right.
And sort of give us some key,
Sorry, you were cut for a second?
You kind of give it some teeth in a way that it doesn't otherwise have.
I agree, and I think the book or the research focused on a specific aspect of copyright law, right? On the derivative works, right? Because this is the kind of bigger claim that I'm trying to make here. But I think that these the importing these notions from creativity studies and from genre theories to the field of copyright law definitely contributes to better understanding and perhaps justifying specific doctrines or basic features of copyright law, the ones you actually mentioned, right? The copyrightable subject matter, idea expression dichotomy, originality, right? The originality requirement. And by the way, it also kind of corresponds in a sense with the more general idea of romantic authorship, right? And the contra movement of the death of the author, right? The Peter Yazzie and Martha Woodmansey project on the death of the romantic authorship approach. So I think even with these type of approaches, we can learn a lot from the non-legal understandings of creativity, and they do not necessarily lead to one direction. So it's not. And I think I'm trying to make this point as well, but what I'm trying to say is that it's not that the fact that creativity studies and genre theories show that the use of prior knowledge and these common building blocks and constraints on creativity absolutely cancel the idea of individualism, right? And let's say more metaphorically romantic authorship, but the individual contribution, the originality of the author to the creative process. No, that's not what they say. They definitely acknowledge and support this idea, but at the same time, they do indicate that there are other significant features to creativity and to the creative process that are not at all dependent or originate from the author herself.
Yeah. Okay. So there's so much that you say in your book, and we just can't cover at all. But I was wondering if, kind of in a nutshell, you could say a little something about how you found that creativity theory and genre studies inform how we should think about the concept of a derivative work and the concept of a creative contribution to a copyrighted work. in a legal
Yeah.
context.
Yeah. So obviously this would be, so this kind of this is the part where we cross the border from the non-legal discussion to the actual legal discussion and how it informs and affects it. And I think if I really need to choose one way in which these ideas and notions and conclusions should inform us about how we should think about the derivative works right and copyright law generally, is that if we agree with the type of analysis or the kind of description of these non-legal fields that I suggest, I think that what immediately follows is that while today copyright law, at least implicitly, determines that derivative works are inferior to a certain extent, right, to original works of authorship, right, that are not based on pre-existing expressions, this is not at all supported by these non-legal notions of or understandings of creativity. And if we really understand, if we really think, and if we really believe that the derivative works are as, or potentially as creative, as important to the creative world as original works of authorship, then we should definitely revisit the doctrine because it's not what it says, or at least it's implicitly. And this is basic. I think this is the most important starting point for the discussion, both for the theoretical discussion on the derivative works right, and the more doctrinal discussion that I suggest in the book.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's one thing I found really interesting about it, was that in a sense, I felt like your work in literary theory, or the kind of the insights you bring in from literary theory, are kind of almost corrosive of a lot of sort of underlying assumptions of copyright doctrine, which people have been like sniping at for a long time, but you bring kind of something much more fundamental to the table, as it were. I mean, it's, you're not just saying that, well, everything builds on something else, but you're really showing how the idea of a quote unquote original work of authorship as opposed to a derivative work is just a false dichotomy.
Yeah, I completely agree, and by the way, this is not to say. So I think there's one important clarification to make. So I'm trying to do this, in the book, but obviously, when you read some of the arguments, and I'm obviously also at least implicitly emotional about these arguments. I guess this somehow passes through the text. But what I am trying to say is that I'm not arguing that these non-legal notions and conclusions are necessarily or should necessarily instruct how we decide copyright law should look like. So we could definitely say that, well, the law has various normative and conceptual sources, and it does not necessarily have to be educated or solely educated by these non-legal fields. And we can decide that we want derivative works to be inferior, right, to original works of authorship. But then, and this is my argument, but if we say that, we need to explain why. Mm-hmm. And I think that when we delve into the normative justifications to copyright law, and even to doctrine, and even to how the derivative works right doctrine is presented right in courts, I was unable to understand or to find a good enough justification to why we suggest to make this type of dichotomy. And if we can't, then I think we have very good reasons to normatively argue that that the doctrine should be adapted.
Well, okay, so this is great. Obviously there's a lot more going on in your book, and I really recommend that people check it out. One thing that's fascinating to me, a little bit of a tangent from your book itself, but reading the book, it's very much focused on United States copyright law. And you talk about kind of alternative European approaches as well, especially in your section on kind of different normative theories of copyright. But there is a kind of U.S. focus. But you're writing from Israel. And, honestly, as a U.S. scholar, I don't know anything about Israeli copyright law, although I know that Israeli law has a lot of kind of parallels to and harmonization with U.S. law. And I was just wondering, like, are there, did writing from Israel and studying in Israel change your perspective on the subject matter of your kind of legal scholarship here at all?
So that's a very good question. I would say that Israeli law generally is very much influenced from Anglo-American law generally as a legal structure, as a legal system, right? Some of our laws are actually actual copies, if you're talking about, but actual copies of English laws that were actually that applied
derivative works
that were enforced, right? The derivative works of English laws that were applicable in Mandate Palestine before the establishment of the State of Israel. So we're obviously very much connected to English and United States jurisprudence as a system, and specifically in the field of intellectual property and copyright law. But it's more than that. It's not only that we're influenced, so that our legislation and laws are influenced or sometimes actually copied from or substantially based on English or American legislative materials, but also our judiciary system, courts in Israel, and specifically the Supreme Court of Israel. And specifically when it discusses, let's say, new fields, right? And I'm characterizing intellectual property and copyright as a new, right, field of law in comparison to perhaps, real estate and taxation and torts. And in these fields, our judges and justices often turn to United States court decisions, specifically the Supreme Court of the United States, but also federal courts as well as English court decisions when they attempt or when they first interpret Israeli legislation, even the Israeli copyright law that, by the way, was reenacted in 2008, and it's a new law. It's an Israeli law. It's not based on previous kind of on the English Copyright Act of 1911 that was that applied to various colonies of the British colonies. It's a new law, but again, when the Supreme Court interprets, the Israeli Supreme Court interprets new concepts in this law, and this includes, the derivative works right never actually reached the Supreme Court in Israel, but other courts as well. When they get to interpret these doctrines, they rely on American jurisprudence and on English jurisprudence, and in this sense, it actually requires Israeli legal scholars that attempt to bring something new to the table here in Israel to immerse themselves in foreign law. And I must say that in the specific context of copyright and the derivative works right, we actually have very, very similar concepts. So the derivative works right in Israel is defined as a work substantially based on pre-existing works. So the only difference between this and the United States definition is the use of the word substantially.
But right? Boy, that could actually make a big difference, though. Substantially.
Well, it could. It definitely could. Although when the infringement tests in the United States are substantial similarity, then it kind of makes it very close. I agree that there could be differences, but it makes it very close. And again, all these, the general ideas that we talked about, the idea expression dichotomy, originality, copyrightable subject matter, these are all concepts that are, often discussed in Israeli courts and are very influenced by American jurisprudence in this case. So this is why American jurisprudence got such a big chunk of the, of the book. And I guess I also used English scholarship or English jurisprudence because it showed an interesting aspect where the overlap that I'm discussing, the overlap between the reproduction right and the derivative works right is actually almost statutorily dictated in England, and this was an interesting feature to present. By the way, the thesis or the PhD thesis, which is the basis for this work, which was written in Hebrew, also holds a part on Israeli law, but this was too much for for an internationally oriented copyright book. But maybe in a follow-up article.
Yeah, a follow-up article would be great. Well, Omri, this has been fantastic. Really great to talk to you about this, about your book, which is great. I'm going to have to reread it because it really sparked a lot of interesting ideas for me. And I was just wondering, as we wrap up, is there anything you want to leave the listeners with about your book or sort of the ideas you're presenting in your book?
Well, I think, and I think I tried to touch on it in the conclusion part of the book. I think that aside from the actual discussion, right, the very specific discussion on derivative works and the doctrine and the doctrinal changes that I suggest, and the feasibility of them to being adopted is questionable, as with any other legal scholarship, or at least this would take a while. I would call other scholarships, by the way, other scholars, right? By the way, both legal scholars and creativity scholars as well, to take this as a kind of a call for future projects. For example, from the creativity studies viewpoint, I would love to see creativity scholars trying to aim their researches and experiments, right, even the more kind of empirical work that they do, to actual works of authorship that correspond with notions from copyright law, right? To understand that copyright law has something to say about their research field, which is kind of an inverse version of what I'm doing. Yeah. And I would love for legal scholars to either expand the to follow up and expand the use of the notions I suggest from these non-legal fields to other copyright or intellectual property doctrines. And also, try proving me wrong. I mean, it would obviously not be as pleasant as receiving compliments, but I mean, I think that this would be a very healthy discussion for copyright law, because if we really understand, or at least if we try to really understand what creativity studies and other non-legal thoughts on creativity and works of authorship, we would definitely have a much richer and more stable, right, and resistant to criticism field and discussions on copyright law. So this would be my
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, Omri, this has been great. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Brian. It's been a pleasure, and I really enjoyed this interview. It was great.